History is usually written in the ink of treaties or the blood of battlefields. It is defined by the decisions of emperors, generals, and presidents. But sometimes, history is written by something much smaller, something invisible to the naked eye. What you are about to hear is the story of a ghost that haunted the trenches of World War II, fueled the manic optimism of the American suburbs, and is currently burning down communities from the inside out. It changes names, it changes shapes, but underneath, it is always the same thing. Before the cartels, before the blitzkrieg, and before the addiction, there was only a tree. This is the ephedra sinica. To the untrained eye, it is nothing. A scraggly, twisted shrub clinging to life on the windswept plateaus of China and Mongolia. It has grown here in the harsh silence. For millions of years, ancient healers called it ma huang. They respected it. They feared it slightly. They brewed its dried stems into bitter teas to clear the lungs and awaken the tired body. It was nature's gift, a tool for survival in a brutal world. For 5 millennia, the plant kept its secrets until the late 19th century, until the collision of East and West. The year is 1885. We are no longer in the open desert. We are in the claustrophobic, coal-stained air of Berlin. A brilliant Japanese chemist named Nagai Nagayoshi is bending over a microscope. He is looking for the soul of the plant. Nagai wanted to understand the ancient medicine of his ancestors using the tools of modern science, and he succeeded. He isolated the active compound, ephedrine. It was a triumph. But science is never satisfied with nature. Chemists are tinkerers by design. They want to improve. They want to perfect. In 1893, Nagai performed a seemingly simple modification. He stripped away a single oxygen atom. He reconfigured the bonds. It was a small change on paper, but in reality, he had just opened Pandora's box. The compound he created did not exist in nature. It was colder, harder, more potent. He named it methamphetamine. Nagai put it in a jar. He wrote a paper. He moved on. He had no idea that he had just synthesized the chemical fuel for the greatest horrors of the 20th century. He didn't know that 40 years later, his discovery would convince a German soldier that he was a god, and 60 years later, it would convince an American mother that she could be perfect. Settle in. This isn't just a story about a drug. This is the story of how a single molecule conquered the world. If you find a value in uncovering the darker corners of our past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Now, let's go back to Berlin. To truly grasp the devastating power of that molecule, we cannot begin in the blood-soaked trenches or the dark, desperate alleys of modern addiction. We must begin in the absolute silence of the mind that created it. The story takes us back in time, away from the noise of the modern world, to the late 19th century, a time when the boundary between magic and science was still thin, and chemists were the new sorcerers of the industrial age. Among them was a young man from the Far East, carrying the discipline of an ancient culture and a burning desire to decode the mysteries of nature using the language of the West. His name was Nagai Nagayoshi. Nagai was born during a turbulent transition in Japanese history. He grew up as the echoes of the samurai era were fading, replaced by the Meiji Restoration, an era where the land of the rising sun threw open its doors to the winds of industrialization from the West. But Nagai did not reject the past. On the contrary, he was fascinated by the legacy of traditional medicine his ancestors had accumulated over thousands of years. In his mind, a question always lingered. Why do those roots, those withered herbs, possess the power to heal? Where does their true strength lie? To answer that, he knew he had to travel to the beating heart of the chemical world, Berlin. In 1883, Nagai arrived in Berlin. It was a world entirely alien to the quiet stone gardens or wooden structures of his homeland. 19th century Berlin was a monster of iron and steam. It was a city of black factory chimneys clawing at the gray sky, of train whistles screaming through the night, and of gas lamps casting sickly yellow reflections on rain-slicked cobblestones. The air was thick with the smell of burning coal, tar, and in the university districts, the pungent sting of ether and ammonia, the signature scent of scientific progress. Imagine Nagai's solitude in the cold heart of Europe, a small man with bright, intense eyes, always dressed in immaculate Western suits, walking quietly down broad boulevards under the bare limbs of winter trees. He was a stranger in a strange land, carrying the weight of a nation eager to prove itself. But that very isolation was the perfect catalyst for focus. Nagai found his sanctuary not in the boisterous cafes or grand theaters, but in the laboratories of the University of Berlin, under the tutelage of August Wilhelm von Hofmann, one of the greatest chemists in history. Under the vaulted ceilings of the lecture hall and in the chemical-laden air of the lab, Nagai learned to view the world through a molecular lens. He learned that everything tangible, from the air we breathe to the food we taste, is built from invisible blocks. And he realized that the key to modernizing Eastern medicine was not to discard it, but to distill it, to strip away the impurities and find the core spirit of the material. The specimen he chose to study was Ma Huang, the humble shrub from the windswept plateaus we saw in the beginning. For thousands of years, Chinese and Japanese healers had boiled these spindly dried stems to treat asthma and congestion. They knew it worked, but they didn't know why. Nagai was determined to find the answer. His days in the laboratory were a cycle of extreme patience and precision, qualities inherent to his heritage. Imagine the clinking of glass, the bubbling of solutions in round-bottom flasks, and the pale glow of a Bunsen burner reflecting on Nagai's furrowed brow. He extracted, filtered, crystallized, and dissolved. He removed the fiber, the plant resin, the color, slowly peeling away the physical layers of the ephedra plant to find the hidden nucleus within. And then, in 1885, the moment arrived. From a pile of dry roots, Nagai isolated a pure, white, crystalline substance. It was no longer a plant. It was a specific chemical compound, an alkaloid. He named it ephedrine. Holding that glass vial of the first ephedrine crystals, Nagai had fulfilled his mission. He had given an ancient remedy a modern chemical identity. Ephedrine was quickly proven to be a mild central nervous system stimulant that constricted blood vessels and opened airways, a perfect chemical explanation for the plant's asthma-treating properties. It was a beautiful intersection of ancient Eastern wisdom and cold Western analysis. If the story stopped here, Nagai Nagayoshi would be remembered simply as a hero of pharmaceutical medicine, a bridge builder between civilizations. But the destiny of human history is often decided by unintentional curiosity. Nagai was not just a healer, he was a chemist, And the instinct of a chemist is never to be satisfied with what nature provides. They always want to take the pieces apart and put them back together in new ways, hoping to find something stronger, something more efficient. 8 years later, in 1893, Nagai returned to his brainchild. He looked at the molecular structure of ephedrine and asked himself, what would happen if I changed it just a little, just a tiny adjustment? In the quiet of the lab, Nagai began a process called reduction. He used red phosphorus and iodine, highly reactive substances, to act upon the ephedrine. His goal was to strip a single oxygen atom from the original molecule. This process demanded absolute precision in temperature and timing. Picture the violet smoke of sublimating iodine clinging to the glass walls, and the silent transformation occurring at an atomic level, invisible to the naked eye. When the reaction finished, what remained in the flask was no longer ephedrine. It had transformed. Its structure was sleeker. Its ability to dissolve in fat increased, allowing it to cross the blood-brain barrier with a terrifying speed that ephedrine could never dream of. Nagai had created a completely new compound, something that had not existed in nature since the earth was formed. He called it methamphetamine. The most shocking thing about this historic moment was its mundanity. There was no clap of thunder, no darkening sky, no omen of the destruction to come. Nagai simply recorded the synthesis process in his notebook and published it in a Japanese pharmaceutical journal with dry, technical descriptions. He noted that this new substance appeared to have a stronger stimulant effect than ephedrine, but at the time, he had no specific vision for its application. To him, it was just an interesting chemical exercise, a small step in a massive research career. Methamphetamine, the monster of the 20th century, was born in the silence and obscurity. For decades, Nagai's formula sat dormant in libraries, gathering dust. The world wasn't ready for it yet. Humanity was still busy with conventional conflicts of gunpowder and crude remedies. Methamphetamine needed a different time and a different form to truly rise, and the man who would awaken this monster was also a son of Japan. In 1919, as the world emerged from the ashes of the First World War, another chemist named Akira Ogata rediscovered Nagai's work. Ogata, carrying that same lineage of meticulousness and sharp intellect, realized that while Nagai's synthesis was effective, it was too complex and costly for mass production. Ogata refined the method. He used red phosphorus and iodine, but applied a streamlined process to reduce the hydroxyl group of ephedrine, creating methamphetamine in a crystalline hydrochloride form. This was a turning point. The liquid form of methamphetamine had been difficult to store and transport, but the crystalline form, what the underworld would later call ice, was stable, pure, and easy to package. The first crystals of methamphetamine, created by Ogata, glinted under the laboratory lights, possessing a haunting, cold beauty. They were transparent, sharp-edged, looking like tiny diamonds or shards of broken ice. In the quiet of Tokyo in 1919, Ogata had unwittingly handed the world the key to unlock the Pandora's box that Nagai had left ajar. The formula was now complete, cheaper, faster, and stronger than anything else. But Japan, at that time, still didn't know what to do with this invention. It remained a purely scientific achievement. It would take another nation, a nation writhing in the pain of defeat and desperate for a supernatural source of energy to restore its national pride, for the dark potential of these crystals to be fully unleashed. On the other side of the globe, Germany was sinking into the shadow of the Treaty of Versailles, its economy exhausted and the spirit of its people broken. They were waiting for a miracle, a savior, or at least a pill that could make them forget the pain and feel powerful again. And when the formula of the Eastern alchemists drifted into the hands of Germany's giant pharmaceutical conglomerates, history turned down a bloody path that no one could have predicted. The story of methamphetamine's innocent birth is over. The era of abuse, of war machines running on chemicals, is about to begin. The era of abuse did not begin with a roar of tanks, but with a collective sigh of exhaustion from a nation brought to its knees. The chemical formula that had traveled from the quiet laboratories of the East was about to find fertile ground in the desperate heart of Europe. To understand why Germany fell so deeply in love with methamphetamine, we must first look at the face of Berlin in the years following the Great War. It was a face gaunt with hunger and gray with humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles had not just ended a war, it had dismantled a national identity. The 1920s in Germany, the Weimar Republic era, was a time of chaotic brilliance, but also profound suffering. Hyperinflation had turned currency into worthless paper. People pushed wheelbarrows full of marks just to buy a loaf of stale bread. The streets were filled with wounded veterans, men with missing limbs and shattered minds, begging on the corners of cobblestone streets that were forever damp with a fog of defeat. There was a pervasive lethargy in the air, a heaviness that settled in the bones of the populace. The German people were tired. They were tired of losing, tired of poverty, and tired of the shame that seemed to hang over the country like a shroud. They were a people waiting for something to wake them up. Into this vacuum of energy stepped a company called Temmler, located in the industrial outskirts of Berlin. The Temmler Werke was a pharmaceutical manufacturer looking for its next big success. The head chemist, Dr. Fritz Hauschild, had been watching the 1936 Berlin Olympics with keen interest. He noticed that American athletes were using a substance called benzedrine, an amphetamine, to boost their performance. It was a legal, over-the-counter decongestant in the US, but its stimulant effects were an open secret. Hauschild, driven by scientific ambition and nationalistic pride, wanted to create something better for Germany. He didn't want to copy the Americans. He wanted to surpass them. He turned to the old papers of Nagai Nagayoshi and Akira Ogata. He saw the potential in the methylated version of the molecule. It was more potent, more direct. Under Hauschild's direction, Temmler patented a new method for synthesizing methamphetamine on October 31st, 1937. They didn't call it methamphetamine, a name that sounded too clinical, too chemical. They gave it a name that sounded modern, efficient, and snappy. They called it Pervitin. It hit the market in 1938, and the timing could not have been more perfect. Germany was in the throes of a radical transformation. The Nazi Party had seized power with promises of national rejuvenation. Adolf Hitler spoke of a great awakening, Deutschland Erwache. He promised to restore the vitality of the Aryan race, to create a Volkskörper, national body, that was hard as Krupp steel and tireless in its devotion to the state. Pervitin became the chemical manifestation of that political promise. The marketing campaign that followed was a masterclass in manipulation, designed to normalize a hard drug into an everyday household staple. Imagine walking down a bustling Berlin street. In 1938, the air is no longer gray. It is electric, with the nervous energy of rearmament. You pass a pharmacy window. There, stacked in neat pyramids, are the small tubes of Pervitin. They are orange and blue, colors of health and vitality. The advertising posters do not show junkies or sick people. They show the ideal German citizen. Picture a poster featuring a woman. She is a Hausfrau, the ideal German mother. She wears a crisp white apron. Her hair is neatly pinned, and her face is glowing with an unnatural radiance. She is surrounded by a mountain of laundry, a crying baby, and a sink full of dishes. But she isn't overwhelmed. She is smiling. Her hand reaches for the tube of Pervitin. The caption implies that with just one tablet, the drudgery of domestic life vanishes, replaced by a joyous, boundless energy. She can clean, she can cook, she can care for her family, and she will never feel the crushing weight of fatigue. It was Mother's Little Helper, decades before the Rolling Stones ever sang the phrase. Look further. There were advertisements targeting the working man, the factory worker on the assembly line, the businessman with a deadline, the night watchman fighting sleep. Alertness instead of coffee, the slogans promised. Tablets for success. Pervitin wasn't sold as a medicine for the sick. It was sold as a performance enhancer for the healthy. It was a tool to optimize the human machine. The most surreal manifestation of this craze was the Hildebrand Pralinen. These were boxes of high-end chocolates, beautifully wrapped, intended for the refined lady. But these weren't ordinary confections. Each chocolate was laced with 14 milligrams of pure methamphetamine, nearly 5 times the dose of a standard Pervitin pill. The tagline was chillingly casual. Hildebrand chocolates make housework a joy. Women were advised to eat 3 to 9 of them a day. They were essentially snacking on potent crystal meth over tea, feeling the rush of dopamine that made the world seem brighter, their husbands more tolerable, and the future more hopeful. The drug permeated every layer of society. It was available without a prescription. You could buy it alongside aspirin and cough drops. In the first few months of its release, millions of tablets were consumed. The psychological impact was profound. For a nation that had felt weak and powerless for 2 decades, Pervitin offered a synthetic sense of invincibility. It artificially inflated the ego. Under the influence of the drug, the German people felt sharper, faster, and more confident. The fatigue of the past was chemically erased, replaced by a manic, wide-eyed focus on the future. This aligned perfectly with the Nazi ideology. The ideal Nazi subject was not supposed to be tired. Sleep was a weakness. Rest was for the inferior. The new man was a being of pure action. Pervitin allowed ordinary people to mimic this impossible standard. It suppressed hunger, useful in a country still rationing food. It suppressed empathy, useful in a country beginning to brutalize its minorities. And it suppressed fear. But while the civilians were enjoying their meth-laced chocolates and energy tablets, a more sinister evaluation was taking place behind closed doors. In the austere offices of the Military Medical Academy in Berlin, a man named Professor Otto Ranke was watching the Pervitin phenomenon with a calculating eye. Ranke was the director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology. His job was to solve the biological limitations of the German soldier. Ranke understood that modern warfare, the kind Hitler was planning, would be different. It would not be the static trench warfare of World War I, where men sat in mud for months. This would be a war of movement, blitzkrieg, lightning war. It required speed, coordination, and endurance that exceeded natural human limits. The greatest enemy of the blitzkrieg was not the French or the British. It was the biological necessity of sleep. A tank driver who falls asleep crashes the tank. A pilot who nods off misses the target. Ronke decided to run an experiment. He recruited 90 university students and divided them into groups. One group was given a placebo, one was given caffeine, and one was given Pervitin. The results were undeniable. The Pervitin group could work for 36 to 48 hours without rest. Their reaction times were faster. Their inhibition was lower. Ronke noted in his logs that while the drug had side effects, some students became irritable, aggressive, or suffered from crashes later. The military utility was too great to ignore. He wrote to the High Command with a recommendation that would change the course of history. Pervitin should not just be allowed for soldiers, it should be standard issue. By 1939, the transition was complete. The people's drug was being militarized. The Temler factory ramped up production to industrial scales. They weren't just pressing pills for housewives anymore. They were pressing them for the Wehrmacht. Millions of tablets were wrapped in foil, packed into crates, and staged at the borders. As the tanks lined up along the Polish frontier, the engines weren't the only things being fueled. The young men sitting inside them, many still teenagers who had grown up in the shadow of defeat, were handed their rations: bread, sausage, and a small packet of white pills. They were told it would help them stay awake. They were told it was for alertness. They didn't know they were swallowing the condensed chemical rage of a nation, a molecule that would push them across Europe at a speed the world had never seen, and eventually drive them off the edge of sanity. The German machine was built. The fuel was in the tank, and the ignition key was about to be turned. When that ignition key was turned on September 1st, 1939, the engine didn't just roar. It screamed with a pitch that shattered the natural rhythm of day and night, plunging Europe into a nightmare of sleepless violence. The invasion of Poland was the world's first introduction to a new kind of warfare, but more importantly, it was the first large-scale field test of a chemically altered human consciousness. To the outside observer, the German Wehrmacht appeared as a singular, terrifying organism, a gray wave of steel and discipline that moved faster than maps could be updated. But inside the cockpits of the Messerschmitts and the cramped, sweating hulls of the Panzer tanks, the reality was far more personal and far more chemical. It began with a sound that would become the soundtrack of the invasion: the crinkle of foil. As the order to advance came down the line, thousands of young men, many of whom had never killed before, reached into their pockets. They retrieved the small, round tubes of Pervitin. They popped the caps. They swallowed the bitter white tablets, washing them down with canteen water or lukewarm coffee. Then they waited. 20 minutes later, the transformation took hold. It starts in the spine, a tingle of artificial electricity. Then, the heart begins to hammer against the ribs, not with the flutter of fear, but with the steady, driving piston beat of aggression. The pupils dilate until the world becomes razor sharp, hyper real. The colors of the Polish countryside, the green of the fields, the brown of the thatched roofs, seemed to vibrate with intensity. Hunger vanished, thirst receded, the natural instinct of self-preservation, that quiet voice in the back of the mind that says, "Stop, this is dangerous," was chemically silenced. In its place came a cold, euphoric arrogance. A German infantryman, writing in his diary during those first days in Poland, described the sensation. The exhaustion just fell away. I felt light, as if I wasn't walking on the dirt, but floating just above it. The rifle in my hands felt like a part of my own body. We marched for 20 miles, and when we stopped, I didn't want to sit. I wanted to keep going. I wanted to run. This was the secret weapon of the Polish campaign. It wasn't just the tanks, it was the drivers who didn't need to sleep, while the Polish defenders, brave and tenacious, adhered to the biological laws of exhaustion, needing to rest, to eat, to close their eyes. The invaders did not. The Germans attacked at dawn, at noon, at dusk, and then, impossibly, they kept attacking through the pitch black of midnight. They were fighting a 24-hour war in a 12-hour world. Poland fell in weeks. The world was stunned. Military strategists in London and Paris couldn't understand the speed of the conquest. They attributed it to superior machinery or tactical genius. They didn't realize that the genius was largely sitting in the bloodstream of the common soldier. But Poland was merely the dress rehearsal. The true test, the moment where Pervitin would etch itself into the history of warfare, came in May 1940, the invasion of France. The German High Command had ordered a supply of 35 million tablets of Pervitin for the Western campaign. It was a logistical decree that treated the drug with the same importance as ammunition or gasoline. The plan, the Sichelschnitt, or sickle cut, relied on a gamble that seemed suicidal. The main German armored force would drive through the Ardennes forest, a region of dense woods, winding roads, and steep hills that French commanders had dismissed as impassable for tanks. To make it work, the Germans couldn't just drive through it. They had to fly through it. Any traffic jam, any delay for rest, would leave their miles-long column exposed to Allied bombers. Speed was the only armor they had. And so, the order was given. No sleep. For 3 days and 3 nights. Imagine the scene inside a Panzer IV tank as it crosses the border into the Ardennes. The space is claustrophobic, smelling of diesel, sweat, and gun oil. The crew has been awake for 24 hours already. The commander shouts over the intercom. He doesn't tell them to rest. He passes around the Pervitin. 1 pill for the day, 2 for the night, 1 more if necessary. By the second night, the forest had ceased to be a geographical location and had become a hallucinatory tunnel. The drug keeps the brain awake, but it does not rest it. The mind begins to fragment. Albrecht, a young radio operator in the 1st Panzer Division, later recounted the surreal horror of that march in a letter that never made it past the censors. The trees are moving. I know they are not, but I see them reaching out for the tracks. The engine noise is inside my head now. I look at Gunther, the driver, and his eyes are wide open, staring, like glass marbles. He hasn't blinked in minutes. He is grinding his teeth. A terrible, rhythmic sound. Kurr, kurr, kurr. Over the roar of the motor. We are all grinding our teeth. We don't talk. We just chew on the silence and the speed. I feel like my heart is going to punch through my chest. But I am not tired. I am not human anymore. I am just a part of this steel box. This is the high of the Blitzkrieg. It was a collective psychosis. Thousands of men, synchronized by chemistry, pushing massive steel beasts through narrow dirt roads without pausing. When they emerged from the forest and crossed the Meuse River, the French troops on the other side were caught completely off guard. They were expecting an army that needed to sleep. Instead, they faced battalions of stormtroopers who surged forward with maniacal energy, their eyes wide and unblinking, seemingly immune to fear. The French psychological collapse was swift. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't stop? An enemy that attacks with the same ferocity at 3 a.m. as they do at 3 p.m. Rumors began to spread in the Allied ranks of a super soldier, a new breed of Aryan warrior. They didn't know that the super soldiers were actually shivering, sweating addicts, holding themselves together with methamphetamine and will. But biology always demands its price. The chemical loan that Pervitin granted had a high interest rate, and after the victory in France, the bill came due. As the adrenaline of combat faded and the Pervitin wore off, the crash swept through the Wehrmacht like a plague. This is the part of the Blitzkrieg that the propaganda reels didn't show. They showed the tanks rolling under the Arc de Triomphe. They didn't show the barracks a few days later. The supermen turned into ghosts. Entire companies effectively collapsed. Men fell into comas of exhaustion, sleeping for 20-30 hours straight. Impossible to wake, even with shouting or shaking. When they finally did wake, they weren't refreshed. They were hollowed out. Depression hit the ranks like a physical blow. The artificial dopamine flood had receded, leaving their brains in a drought. Soldiers became irritable, paranoid, and violently aggressive toward each other. Discipline frayed. Officers reported men shooting at shadows, screaming at invisible enemies, or sobbing uncontrollably for no apparent reason. The heart attacks began to happen. Young men, fit and healthy, would simply clutch their chests and drop dead while cleaning their rifles. Their hearts, pushed to beat at a sprint for days on end without rest, had simply given out. Dr. Otto Ranke, the architect of this chemical strategy, began to receive alarming reports from the field medical officers. One report from a medical officer in the 12th Army read, "The troops are finished. They are not just tired, they are broken. The Pervitin keeps them moving. Yes, but the man inside is gone. We are leading an army of sleepwalkers. They see things that aren't there. They are indifferent to death, which is good for fighting, but they are also indifferent to life, which is dangerous for discipline. We are creating a dependency that we cannot control." There is a particularly haunting account from a German soldier named Heinrich Bull, who would later become a Nobel Prize-winning author. In his letters home from the front, the desperation for the drug is palpable, stripping away any illusion of military glory to reveal the raw addiction underneath. "Dear parents," he wrote, his handwriting jagged and rushed, "I am writing this by the light of a flashlight. The others are asleep, but I cannot. The silence is too loud. Please, in your next package, send me more Pervitin. The medical officer is rationing it now, and I cannot function without it. It is the only thing that takes away the gray veil. I need it to be alert. I need it to be me. Don't forget. Pervitin. Love. Heinrich." It was a plea that was echoed in thousands of letters sent from the front lines back to families in Munich, Berlin, and Hamburg. The soldiers weren't asking for chocolate or cigarettes. They were begging for their meth. The conquest of France was a military masterpiece, but it was a pharmacological tragedy. The German army had achieved the impossible, but they had done so by borrowing energy from their own future. They had turned their soldiers into disposable batteries, drained of their humanity to power the machine of conquest. As the swastika flag was hoisted over Paris, the soldiers looked victorious. But if you looked closely, past the crisp uniforms and the polished boots, into their eyes, you would see the truth. You would see the dilated pupils of men who had seen too much and slept too little. You would see the twitching hands, the gaunt cheeks, the grinding jaws. They had won the world, but they were losing their minds. And watching all of this from his headquarters, obsessed with the reports of this miraculous speed and energy, was a man who saw in Pervitin not a warning, but a solution to his own deteriorating health. Adolf Hitler had watched his army march on crystal meth, and he decided that if his soldiers could be supermen, then their leader must be a god. The addiction that had consumed the trenches was about to ascend to the highest throne of the Third Reich. If the Wehrmacht was the body of the Third Reich, pushing itself beyond human limits with chemical fuel, then Adolf Hitler was its rotting brain, slowly disintegrating under the influence of the very same substance he had unleashed upon his soldiers. The narrative of Hitler's health has long been shrouded in mystery and propaganda, but to understand the erratic, paranoid, and catastrophic decisions made in the second half of the war, we must look past the uniform and into the veins of the man designated in secret medical journals simply as Patient A. By 1941, the Blitzkrieg had stalled in the freezing mud of Russia. The quick victory promised by the Pervitin Rush had evaporated, replaced by a grinding war of attrition. Hitler, who had styled himself as the invincible warlord, was beginning to feel the weight of mortality. He was exhausted, his stomach plagued him with chronic cramps, and his energy, the charisma that held the Nazi Party together, was fading. He needed a solution. He needed a fix. Enter Dr. Theodor Morell. Morell was an unlikely physician for a dictator obsessed with Aryan purity. He was obese, unkempt, and reportedly emitted a pungent body odor that repulsed the other high-ranking Nazi officials. Hermann Göring called him the Reich injection master behind his back. But Morell possessed something that the traditional, rigid doctors of the German medical establishment did not: a willingness to experiment. He didn't offer Hitler diet and exercise. He offered him a syringe. It began innocently enough, with glucose and vitamins. But as the war turned against Germany, Hitler's demands for immediate relief and instant energy grew more desperate. Morell responded by creating a magic soup of substances. Over 80 different drugs were eventually administered. But the cornerstone of this regimen, the fuel that kept the Führer standing, was methamphetamine. Morell disguised it in his notes. He often referred to his injections as Wiedermolten or X, but the effects described in his meticulous diaries leave little room for doubt. He would administer an injection in the morning, often while Hitler was still in bed. Within minutes, the lethargy would vanish. Hitler would rise, talk incessantly for hours. His eyes bright, his confidence restored. He would rant about secret weapons and final victories, while his generals looked on in weary silence. By 1943, the leader of Germany was essentially functioning as a high-functioning junkie. The physical toll was horrifying to witness for those trapped in the Wolf's Lair headquarters with him. The newsreels of the time were carefully edited, but raw footage and eyewitness accounts tell a different story. We see the tremors. The most famous symptom was the uncontrollable shaking of his left hand. At the time, whispers circulating among the staff attributed it to Parkinson's disease, and while that may have been a factor, the pharmacology of long-term methamphetamine abuse offers a parallel explanation. Methamphetamine destroys the dopamine receptors in the brain, specifically in the basal ganglia, the area that controls motor function. Chronic use leads to stereotypy, repetitive, involuntary movements. Hitler's tremor was often so violent that he would have to hold his left hand with his right just to keep it still while reviewing maps. He would hide it behind his back during inspections. But the mental deterioration was far more dangerous. As the drug flooded his system, it amplified his worst traits. His natural suspicion blossomed into full-blown paranoia. Methamphetamine locks the user in a loop of obsessive thought. For Hitler, this manifested as a fixation on the maps and minor details. He would stay awake for days, staring at the same lines on the chart, moving imaginary divisions that had long since been destroyed, convinced that his will alone could alter reality. He stopped listening to his generals. How could he listen to them when the chemical rushing through his brain told him he was a genius? When Rommel or Manstein tried to explain the reality of the front lines, the lack of fuel, the overwhelming enemy numbers, Hitler would fly into the infamous rages. These weren't just temper tantrums. They were likely chemically induced psychotic breaks. The drug stripped away his emotional regulation, leaving him raw and volatile. However, it would be a mistake to think that the Third Reich was the only power running on stimulants. While Hitler was disintegrating on Pervitin, the forces gathering to destroy him were engaging in their own chemical romance. Across the English Channel and the Atlantic, the Allies had initially looked at the German energy pills with horror, dismissing them as a sign of Nazi depravity. But as the efficacy of the Blitzkrieg became undeniable, moral judgment was quickly replaced by military pragmatism. If the enemy was awake for 3 days, the Allies could not afford to sleep. The British and Americans turned to their own molecule, amphetamine sulfate, marketed under the brand name Benzedrine. Chemically, Benzedrine was the cleaner cousin of Pervitin. It lacked the methyl group that made Pervitin so aggressive and neurotoxic. It was smoother, less jittery, and slightly less potent. But make no mistake, it was speed. And unlike the clandestine injections in Hitler's bunker, Benzedrine was embraced with the open, industrial efficiency of the West. In the United States, Benzedrine didn't start in the barracks. It started in the pharmacy. In the 1930s, the Smith, Kline and French pharmaceutical company sold it as an inhaler for nasal congestion. It was a household item. But people quickly realized that if you cracked open the plastic tube and swallowed the paper strip soaked in the drug, it cleared your head in a very different way. By the time war was declared, a generation of American students, truck drivers, and workers were already familiar with the PEP pill. When the U.S. Army Air Forces entered the war, Benzedrine became standard issue. They called them go pills. The logic was brutal, but sound. A B-17 bomber pilot flying a mission from England to Berlin faced a 10-hour ordeal in a freezing, unpressurized cockpit, dodging flak and fighters. A moment of inattention meant death for the crew of 10. Fatigue was as deadly as the Luftwaffe. Dr. Ruskin, an American medical officer, wrote in a report, "The drug is a tool. It is no different than the turbo supercharger on the engine. One gives the plane more power, the other gives the pilot more focus." Millions of Benzedrine tablets were distributed to American and British troops. In the Royal Air Force, they were critical during the Battle of Britain. Outnumbered pilots, flying 3 or 4 sorties a day against the German Armada, used stimulants to keep their eyes open and their reflexes sharp. There is a profound irony in the image of the air war over Europe. You had German pilots in their Messerschmitts, tweaked on Pervitin, dogfighting against British Spitfire pilots, buzzing on Benzedrine. It was a war of ideologies, yes, but it was also a war of dopaminergic overstimulation. The sky was filled with young men whose hearts were racing at 140 beats per minute, their fear chemically suppressed, locking eyes through gun sights in a hyper-real dance of death. However, the Allied approach was different in one crucial way: dosage and culture. The Allies saw the drug as a temporary utility for specific missions. The Germans, under the influence of Nazi ideology and total war, saw it as a lifestyle, a permanent state of being, and nowhere was the end result of that philosophy more evident than in the final days of the war, deep beneath the streets of a burning Berlin, April 1945, the Führer bunker. The world above was ending. Soviet artillery was pulverizing the city into dust. The Third Reich had shrunk to a few concrete rooms buried 50 feet underground. The air recycling system hummed monotonously, unable to filter out the smell of fear, unwashed bodies, and concrete dust. In this claustrophobic tomb, Patient A was facing a crisis that had nothing to do with the Russians. His supply was running out. The factories that produced Pervitin had been bombed. The supply lines were cut. Dr. Morell's medicine chest was empty. Hitler was not just losing the war, he was going into withdrawal. Witness accounts from the bunker describe a man who was a husk. He shuffled rather than walked. He drooled. His skin was pasty and gray, covered in needle tracks that had collapsed his veins. The charismatic orator who had mesmerized millions was reduced to a trembling, incoherent wreck, sitting on a velvet sofa, staring at a portrait of Frederick the Great. The withdrawal symptoms of long-term methamphetamine abuse are crushing: profound depression, anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, extreme fatigue, and suicidal ideation. As the Red Army closed in, Hitler was likely experiencing the mother of all crashes. The delusion of invincibility provided by the drug had finally shattered, leaving him to face the absolute ruin he had created with a brain that was chemically incapable of processing hope or resilience. While American GIs were celebrating with cigarettes and chocolate, and British pilots were coming down from their Benzedrine highs with a stiff drink, the man who started it all was trembling in the dark, waiting for the end. The Allied soldiers who eventually discovered the stockpiles of German pharmaceuticals were shocked. They found millions of Pervitin tablets, but they also found something else: detailed records. They realized that the Nazi war machine hadn't just been defeated by strategy and steel. It had burned itself out. It had overdosed. But as the guns fell silent in Europe, the ghost of the molecule did not vanish. It simply migrated The stockpiles didn't disappear, they were looted, and on the other side of the world, in a defeated island nation, a new chapter of the epidemic was about to open. The Hitler speed was dead, but the Philippon tragedy was just beginning. The war was over. The addiction was not. The war was over. The addiction was not. And while the bunkers of Berlin were being scrubbed of their chemical stains, the ghost of the molecule was already migrating across the globe to an island nation that had been reduced to ash and silence. If Germany was the laboratory where methamphetamine was weaponized, Japan was the petri dish where it was allowed to fester into the world's first true civilian epidemic. The story of post-war Japan is often told as a miracle of economic recovery, a phoenix rising from the radioactive dust of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But history rarely mentions the fuel that powered that ascent. The skyscrapers of Tokyo and the shipyards of Osaka were not rebuilt solely on rice and determination. They were built on a foundation of sleepless nights and a pharmaceutical brand name that sounded deceptively friendly, Philippon. To understand the tragedy, we must first visualize the landscape of August 1945. Japan was not just defeated, it was obliterated. The firebombing of Tokyo had reduced the wooden city to a charred skeleton. The atomic bombs had vaporized the concept of the future. The emperor, previously considered a living god, had surrendered over the radio in a human voice. The psychological state of the nation was described by the term kyodatsu, a condition of profound exhaustion, despondency, and collapse. The people were starving. The industrial base was gone. The soul of the country was hollowed out. But amidst this wasteland, there was one commodity that was in surplus. During the war, the Japanese military had embraced methamphetamine with a fanaticism that rivaled, and perhaps exceeded, the Germans. They called it Hirapon or Philippon. The name was derived from the Greek word Philipponos, which translates to lover of labor. It was a cruel irony that would define the next decade. The drug was manufactured by the Dainippon Pharmaceutical Company and stockpiled in massive quantities to fuel the kamikaze pilots on their one-way missions, to keep factory workers awake for 20-hour shifts, and to steal the nerves of soldiers expecting a final invasion of the homeland. That invasion never came. When the surrender was signed, the military warehouses were bursting with millions of doses of high-grade methamphetamine. In a functioning society, these dangerous stockpiles would have been destroyed. But Japan in 1945 was not a functioning society. It was a chaotic vacuum. The American occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, were focused on disarmament and political restructuring. They paid little attention to the boxes of medicine stored in supply depots. And so the floodgates opened. Whether through corruption, incompetence, or a desperate desire to recoup losses, the stockpiles were released. Sometimes they were sold legitimately through pharmacies. Often they were looted by returning soldiers and diverted into the black market. Suddenly, in a country where you couldn't find a bowl of rice or a clean shirt, you could buy a handful of Philippon tablets for the price of a pack of cigarettes. The marketing slogans from the war era still echoed on the peeling posters. Clear the head, strong the body, but the context had changed. The drug was no longer for dying for the emperor. It was for surviving the peace. Imagine the streets of Tokyo in 1946. It is a landscape of black markets, known as yamaichi. The air smells of sewage, unwashed bodies, and roasting sweet potatoes. Shacks made of corrugated iron and scavenged wood lined the muddy paths. In the shadows of these ruins, a new class of addict was being born. The first wave of users were the veterans, men who had returned from the brutal fronts of China and the Pacific, carrying the trauma of atrocities and the shame of defeat. They had been hooked on the drug by their officers. Now they took it to numb the memories. They wandered the ruins, gaunt and wide-eyed, known as the burnt-out generation. But the epidemic quickly mutated. The government and the corporate entities, desperate to rebuild the economy, tacitly encouraged the use of stimulants. The logic was cold and industrial. The nation has no money, no resources, and limited time. We must work harder than any other nation on earth. Philippon became the fuel of the Japanese economic miracle. Construction workers took it to erect buildings overnight. Students took it to pass the grueling entrance exams that determined their social standing. Artists and writers, like the famous Osamu Dazai, took it to fuel their nihilistic creativity. But the most tragic demographic were the night laborers and the pan-pan girls, the street prostitutes who serviced the American GIs. For these women, standing on freezing corners in Ginza or Shinjuku, Philippon was a necessity. It killed the hunger pangs, a crucial benefit when food was scarce. It provided a false warmth against the winter chill. And most importantly, it severed the emotional connection to their reality, allowing them to endure the nightly degradation with a chemical smile. By the late 1940s, the lover of labor had become a national lover. It is estimated that by 1948, nearly 5% of the entire Japanese population, over 2 million people, were using methamphetamine regularly. To put that in perspective, that is a higher usage rate than the worst years of the crack epidemic in America. Japan was a nation vibrating on a frequency of pure, synthetic dopamine. The streets of Tokyo began to change. The silence of the defeat was replaced by a manic, frantic energy. Neon signs flickered on, powered by electricity and speed. The city became known as the city that never sleeps, not because of romance, but because its inhabitants literally could not close their eyes. But as we saw in Germany, the biology of the human brain cannot be cheated forever. The crash that hit Japan was not just individual, it was societal. By the early 1950s, the side effects of chronic, high-dose methamphetamine use began to manifest on a horrific scale. The Japanese doctors coined a new term, Hiropon Chudoku, Philippon intoxication. The mental hospitals, already underfunded and understaffed, were overwhelmed by patients exhibiting signs of paranoid schizophrenia. Newspapers were filled with lurid stories of Philippon crimes, a mother decapitating her child because she believed he was a demon, a salaryman jumping in front of a train because voices told him he was being followed. The drug stripped away the famous Japanese social reserve, revealing a raw, violent underbelly. The social fabric, held together by centuries of tradition and honor, was being dissolved by a simple methyl group. It was in this chaos that the modern Yakuza was forged. Before the war, the Yakuza were largely loose associations of gamblers and tequila, street peddlers. They were criminals, yes, but they operated within a certain code. The Philippon epidemic transformed them. When the Japanese government finally realized the scale of the disaster and passed the stimulant control law in 1951, banning the production and sale of meth, they inadvertently handed the Yakuza the keys to the kingdom. When the legal pharmacies stopped selling Philippon, the demand didn't vanish, it merely went underground, and the Yakuza were waiting. They seized the remaining military stockpiles. When those ran out, they set up clandestine labs. They recruited the unemployed chemists who had once worked for the imperial war effort, men like Nagai's successors, and paid them to cook. The Yakuza realized that methamphetamine was the perfect product. It was addictive, it was consumable, and the profit margins were astronomical. This was the era of the pistol and Philippon. The gangs fought bloody turf wars over distribution routes. The image of the modern Yakuza, the suits, the tattoos, the missing fingers, became inextricably linked with the white powder. They didn't just sell drugs, they used them. The Tepodama, bullets, or low-level enforcers, were often paid in meth, sent on suicide missions against rival gangs while high on the very product they defended. The transformation of the Yakuza from gamblers to drug lords was the direct result of this period. They built an empire on the addiction of their own people, an empire that would eventually stretch across the Pacific. There is a specific, haunting scene that captures the essence of this era. It comes from the writings of a police officer working in the Sanya district, a slum for day laborers, in 1954. He describes walking through a flophouse dormitory at 3 a.m. The room is packed with sleeping bodies, men exhausted from building the new Tokyo. But in the corner, under a single bare light bulb, a group of men are squatting in a circle. They are not drinking sake. They are passing around a syringe. The needle is dull, used by dozens of others. They take turns injecting the work medicine. They don't look like criminals. They look like skeletons. Their skin is gray, covered in the sores of meth mites, the hallucination that bugs are crawling under the skin. They are grinding their teeth, the sound echoing in the quiet room like stones rubbing together. Krr, krr, krr. They are not injecting to get high, the officer wrote. They are injecting to feel human. They have sold their souls to the Philippon demon, and now they are just husks, waiting to die. The Japanese government eventually launched a massive crackdown. They didn't treat it as a health crisis. They treated it as a war. Police swept the streets. Tens of thousands of addicts were arrested and thrown into prisons or forced labor camps. Public service announcements showed terrifying images of insanity and death. Slowly, painfully, the first wave of the epidemic was brought under control. The visible signs of Philippon faded from the streets. The neon lights of Tokyo continued to shine, but the frantic, drug-fueled edge of the reconstruction softened into the steady rhythm of corporate prosperity. But the damage was done. A generation had been scarred. The Yakuza had been empowered. And most importantly, the knowledge of the drug, the recipes, the synthesis methods, the distribution networks had not been destroyed. It had simply been driven into the shadows, waiting for a new market. And as the 1950s progressed, that market began to emerge across the ocean. The American occupation soldiers, who had policed the ruins of Tokyo and frequented the establishments of the Pan girls, were returning home. They were bringing back souvenirs, silk kimonos, samurai swords, and a taste for a certain white powder that made them feel like kings. The ghost was done with Japan. It was time to cross the Pacific. It was time to conquer the American dream. The ghost of the molecule did not storm the beaches of California like an invading army, nor did it creep into the alleyways like a thief. Instead, it walked right through the front door of the American dream, dressed in a lab coat, and hid itself inside the medicine cabinets of the most respectable homes in the country. While Japan was rebuilding its ruins with the frantic energy of the Yakuza and the black market, the United States was busy constructing a different kind of facade. This was the 1950s. The war was won. The economy was booming. The nightmare of the Depression and the bloodshed of Europe were visible only in the rearview mirror. America was speeding down a new highway of prosperity, and the destination was the suburbs, Levitt Town, the white picket fence, the manicured green lawn, the vacuum-sealed perfection of a life where everything had its place. To the outside world, this was utopia. But inside those pastel-colored houses, a quiet crisis was brewing, and the primary victim of this crisis, and soon the primary consumer of the molecule, was the American housewife. The cultural narrative of the 1950s placed an agonizing weight on women. They were expected to be everything at once: the flawless mother, the devoted wife, the gourmet chef, the cleaning lady, and the social hostess. They were expected to maintain a waistline of 24 inches and a smile that never faltered, all while managing a household that was becoming increasingly isolated from the community support systems of the past. The pressure was not violent, but it was suffocating. It was the tyranny of perfection. By the mid-afternoon, after the laundry was done, the floors waxed, and the children sent to play, a strange silence would settle over the suburbs. It was a silence filled with boredom, exhaustion, and a vague, nameless anxiety. Betty Friedan would later call this the problem that has no name. But the pharmaceutical industry had a name for it. They called it fatigue. They called it obesity. They called it mild depression. And they had the cure. In the 1950s, amphetamines and methamphetamine were not seen as street drugs. They were miracle medicine. The FDA had approved them for a laundry list of conditions that seems absurd by modern standards. If you were sad, amphetamines. If you were tired, amphetamines. If you had low libido, amphetamines. But the biggest market, the golden goose for companies like Abbott, Laboratories, and Smith, Klein and French, was weight loss. This was the era of the diet pill. Doctors, trusted implicitly by their patients, handed out prescriptions like candy. The most potent among them was a brand called Desoxyn. The generic name on the bottle read methamphetamine hydrochloride. It was the exact same chemical that had fueled the Wehrmacht tanks through the Ardennes. Now pressed into a small, innocent-looking white tablet and sold to Mrs. Smith in Ohio to help her fit into her prom dress again. Then there was Obitrol, a popular cocktail that contained a mix of amphetamine salts and methamphetamine. It was marketed aggressively in women's magazines. The ads didn't feature soldiers or jagged crystals. They featured illustrations of slender, vibrant women in high heels, vacuuming with one hand and holding a cocktail tray with the other. The copy promised that these pills would curb the appetite and banish the blues. And they worked. That was the seductive trap. Imagine a Tuesday morning in 1954. A housewife takes her pill with her morning coffee. Within 20 minutes, the rush hits. It's smoother than the jagged edge of wartime Pervitin, refined by better manufacturing. But the mechanism is the same. The dopamine floods the brain. The exhaustion of scrubbing floors vanishes. The hunger pangs disappear. She feels a surge of unearned confidence. The house looks brighter. The tasks that seemed drudgery suddenly feel like a game she can win. She cleans with a laser like focus. She skips lunch. She greets her husband at the door with a martini and a smile, buzzing with a chemical vibrancy that mimics happiness. It was the pop a pill culture. It was civilized. It was prescribed. It was the American way of better living through chemistry. But to truly understand the tragedy of this era, we need to look beyond the anonymous housewife and focus on the woman who became the tragic avatar of this systemic abuse, Judy Garland. Judy was America's sweetheart, the girl from The Wizard of Oz who sang about rainbows and dreams. But behind the curtain, her life was a horror story written by the studio system and inked with amphetamines. Her addiction didn't start in a dark alley. It started in the executive offices of Metro Goldwyn Mayer. As a teenager, Judy was worked to the bone. To keep her dancing and singing for 18 hours a day, the studio doctors, the original Dr. Feelgoods, fed her pills. They gave her Benzedrine and Dexedrine to wake her up in the morning and keep her thin. Judy had a natural curvature to her spine and a tendency to gain weight, sins that were unforgivable in Hollywood. The pills fixed both. They killed her appetite and gave her the manic energy to perform. But the human body demands sleep. So, when the cameras stopped rolling and Judy was vibrating with residual stimulation, unable to close her eyes, they gave her barbiturates, sleeping pills, to knock her out. She was trapped in a chemical cycle. Uppers to work, downers to sleep. Wake up, pop a pill. Go to bed, pop a pill. It was a seesaw of biological chaos that destroyed her metabolism and fractured her psyche. By the 1950s, Judy Garland was a global superstar, but she was also a woman disintegrating in public. Her weight fluctuated violently. She was known for being difficult, for missing rehearsals, for emotional outbursts. The press called her temperamental. The truth was, she was a severe methamphetamine and barbiturate addict, created and sustained by the industry that profited from her talent. Her story is the celebrity version of what was happening in thousands of suburban homes. The nerves that women complained of were often the jittery side effects of the speed they were taking. The mood swings were the crash. The insomnia was the direct result of the morning's diet pill. And just like Judy, the American housewife found herself needing something to come down. This led to the widespread prescription of barbiturates like Seconal and Nembutol, and later the benzodiazepine Valium, the titular mother's little helper. The result was a generation of women living in a pharmaceutical fog. They were stimulated during the day and sedated at night. They were thin, yes. Their houses were clean, yes. But they were brittle. The terrifying aspect of this period was the normalization. It wasn't a secret. It was a conversation starter at bridge clubs. Oh, you must try Dr. Miller. His pills are marvelous. I've lost 10 pounds in a week, and I simply have so much energy. One specific formulation, the Rainbow Diet pill, became infamous. Doctors would prescribe a daily packet of colorful pills, a blue one for the morning, methamphetamine, a green one for lunch, thyroid hormone to boost metabolism, a red one for the afternoon, more amphetamine, and a yellow one for the evening, a sedative. It was a chemical bomb. Patients were essentially being poisoned. Their hearts stressed to the breaking point, their thyroids destroyed. By the late 1950s, the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. Emergency rooms began seeing women with nervous breakdowns, which were actually stimulant-induced psychoses. Heart attacks among young, healthy women increased. The crash could no longer be hidden behind a layer of lipstick. There is a haunting anecdote from a writer who grew up in this era. He recalled watching his mother clean the kitchen. She was scrubbing the same spot on the counter for 45 minutes, her jaw clenched, her movements jerky and robotic. Scrub, scrub, scrub. She was humming a tune, but her eyes were empty. She was there, but she wasn't there. She was trapped in the tweak, the obsessive, repetitive behavior characteristic of methamphetamine overdose. To her son, she looked like the perfect, industrious mother. To a modern addiction specialist, she would look like a junkie. The golden age of the 1950s was, in many ways, a hallucination fueled by speed. The optimism was chemically enhanced. The productivity was borrowed. And the children of this generation, the baby boomers, were watching. They watched their parents pop pills to wake up and pop pills to sleep. They watched the hypocrisy of a society that preached moral purity while running on synthetic dopamine. They saw the emptiness behind the manicured lawns. And as the decade turned, these children would grow up. They would reject the gray flannel suits and the aprons. They would reject the prescription bottles of their parents, only to turn to the black market versions of the same substances. They would take the energy of the 1950s and twist it into the rebellion of the 1960s. The ghost of the molecule was about to shed its lab coat. It was about to grow its hair long, jump on a motorcycle, and ride straight into the heart of the counterculture. The age of the diet pill was ending. The age of the speed freak was about to begin. The age of the speed freak did not begin with a bang, but with a cultural theft. The children of the diet pill generation didn't just reject their parents' values. They raided their medicine cabinets, took the very substance that had kept the American suburbs spotless, and dragged it into the mud of the counterculture. If the 1950s was the era of the respectable, hidden addict, the 1960s was the era where the monster finally showed its true, ugly face in public. The ghost of the molecule, having traversed the battlefields of Europe and the living rooms of Levittown, now found a new home in the pulsating heart of the youth rebellion, Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco. At first, the summer of love was fueled by psychedelics. LSD and marijuana were the sacraments of the new consciousness. They were about opening the mind, expanding perception, and dissolving the ego. But lurking in the background of this colorful explosion was a darker, harder chemical. Amphetamine was cheap. It was everywhere. And it didn't make you contemplate the universe. It made you think you were the center of it. As the decade wore on, the flower power optimism began to wilt, and a harder edge took over. The methedrin users moved in. They were different from the acid heads. They didn't sit in circles strumming guitars. They paced. They talked over each other in rapid-fire staccato monologues. They were aggressive, paranoid, and intensely focused on the immediate now. The phrase speed kills was born on the streets of San Francisco in the late 60s. It wasn't just a government slogan. It was a warning painted on walls by the hippies themselves, a desperate plea to save their movement from the speed freaks who were rotting it from the inside. But the warning went unheeded. The molecule had found a new host, one far more dangerous than the bored housewife. Enter the Hells Angels. The outlaw motorcycle gangs had always lived on the fringes of society, existing in a world of violence, chrome, and diesel. Initially, they were just consumers of the drug. They called it crank, a term derived from the habit of hiding their stash inside the crankcase of their motorcycles to avoid police detection. The drug was perfect for their lifestyle. It allowed them to ride for days without sleep, to fight with savage intensity, and to maintain an aura of menacing invincibility. But as the 1970s approached, the supply chain began to break. The US government, finally waking up to the epidemic that had started in the 50s, passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. This legislation classified amphetamines as Schedule II controlled substances. Overnight, the Dr. Feelgoods were shut down. The prescriptions dried up. The flood of pharmaceutical-grade pills that had washed over the country for 20 years was turned off. This was the pivotal moment. This was the moment the molecule mutated. When the legal tap was turned off, the demand didn't vanish. The Hells Angels saw an opportunity. They stopped being just customers and became the cooks. They realized that they didn't need a sterile laboratory or a PhD in chemistry to make speed. They just needed a recipe, some privacy, and a willingness to handle volatile poisons. The production of methamphetamine moved from the gleaming factories of pharmaceutical giants to the filthy, grease-stained garages of biker clubhouses and deep into the secluded forests of rural America. This shift in production marked a terrifying change in the drug itself. The bikers didn't have access to the refined precursors used by the pharmaceutical industry. Instead, they turned to a crude, dirty method of synthesis known as the P2P method, phenyl 2-propanone. This was bathtub meth in its most literal sense. The chemistry was messy and dangerous. It involved a witch's brew of toxic ingredients, hydrochloric acid, ether, and the chemical phenyl 2-propanone, which smelled distinctly and horribly of cat urine. Imagine a shack hidden deep in the redwood forests of Northern California or the pine barrens of Oregon. Inside, the air is thick with chemical fumes so corrosive they peel the paint off the walls. A cook, often a biker with a rudimentary understanding of chemistry passed down like oral folklore, stands over a bubbling flask. There is no quality control. There is no safety equipment. If the temperature gets too high, the ether ignites, and the entire shack explodes in a fireball. This happened frequently, leaving behind charred clearings that locals learned to avoid. The product that emerged from these labs was not the clean, white tablet of the 1950s. It was a yellowish, oily powder, often smelling of solvent or rotten eggs. It was cut with anything the bikers had on hand: baby laxatives, caffeine, even battery acid. It was weaker than the pharmaceutical stuff, which meant users had to inject it to get the same rush. This was the birth of the needle culture, the transition from swallowing a pill to injecting a mysterious sludge directly into the vein changed the psychology of addiction fundamentally. The ritual became as important as the high. The needle left tracks, scars that marked the user as an outcast. The atmosphere of the drug culture shifted from the party vibe to something predatory and grim. You can see this shift in the music festivals of the era. If Woodstock was the peak of the psychedelic dream, the Altamont Free Concert in 1969 was the meth-fueled nightmare. The Hells Angels were hired as security. Fueled by beer and crank, they beat concertgoers with pool cues and eventually stabbed a man to death in front of the stage while the Rolling Stones played. It was the death of the 60s, presided over by the aggression of methamphetamine. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the speed freak had become a recognizable archetype in the American underbelly. The physical toll of the biker meth was horrific because the P2P meth was a racemic mixture containing both the L-methamphetamine, which affects the body, and D-methamphetamine, which affects the brain. It caused severe physical side effects. Users didn't just get high, they vibrated. Their bodies couldn't stay still. But the most disturbing symptom was the formication, the hallucination that bugs were crawling under the skin. Picture a crankster in a cheap motel room in 1982. He hasn't slept in 5 days. The shades are drawn. He is shirtless, his ribs showing through his pale skin. He is picking at his arms, digging with his fingernails to get the bugs out, leaving open, weeping sores. His teeth are beginning to grind down to nothing. He is taking apart a toaster, convinced that the FBI has planted a listening device inside the heating element. This was the reality of the speed kills era. It was dirty, it was violent, and it was isolated. The biker gangs ran this world with an iron fist. They controlled the distribution networks, using their chapters to move the foul-smelling powder from the West Coast across the country. They enforced their monopoly with brutal violence. If you cooked without their permission, you disappeared. If you snitched, you disappeared. However, the P2P method had a flaw. It was difficult to get the chemicals in large enough quantities to truly scale up. The government began watching the sales of phenyl-2-propanone. The bikers were limited by their own chemistry. They could supply the local addicts, the truck stops, and the dive bars, but they couldn't flood the nation. The epidemic simmered. It was a low-grade fever burning in the rural backwaters and the gritty urban pockets. To the mainstream media and the average American in the 1980s, drugs meant cocaine, Miami Vice, Wall Street bankers doing lines in bathroom stalls, crack cocaine in the inner cities. Methamphetamine was seen as a white trash drug, a dirty habit for bikers and truckers, something that happened in trailer parks, not in penthouses. But while the world was watching the cocaine cowboys, a new discovery was being made. In the early 1980s, a savvy cook, perhaps a chemist who had lost his license, or a particularly bright biker, realized that they had been doing it the hard way. They were trying to build the molecule from scratch using difficult chemicals. They realized they didn't need to build it. They just need to modify it. They remembered the original work of Nagai Nagayoshi. They looked at the ingredients in the cold medicine aisle of the local pharmacy. Sudafed, cold tablets. They contained pseudoephedrine. It was the same epiphany that Nagai had a century earlier, but now applied with criminal intent. Pseudoephedrine was already 90% of the way to being methamphetamine. You didn't need a complex lab. You didn't need P2P. You just needed to strip that one oxygen atom away. This realization would act as the spark for the next, most devastating explosion. The bikers had kept the flame alive in the darkness of the forest. But the new method, the ephedrine reduction method, was about to bring the fire back to civilization. The age of the bikers was ending. The age of the super lab and the cartel was about to begin. The molecule was about to shed its dirty, oily skin and return to its crystalline purity, deadlier and more abundant than ever before. The forests were quiet, but the desert to the south was beginning to stir. The forests were quiet, but the desert to the south was beginning to stir. While the American biker gangs were poisoning themselves in the woods with their dirty chemistry, a new breed of predator was watching from across the border, realizing that the future of the drug trade wasn't in the erratic, small-scale chaos of the outlaw, but in the cold, ruthless efficiency of the corporation. In the 1980s and 90s, the methamphetamine narrative shifted tectonically. It moved from the hands of bearded men in leather vests to the hands of men in silk suits and tactical gear. The era of the cook was over. The era of the chemist had returned, and the epicenter of this earthquake was Mexico. For decades, Mexican trafficking organizations had been the logistics experts of the underworld, moving marijuana and cocaine for the Colombian cartels. They were the truck drivers, the tunnel diggers, the middlemen, but they were tired of being the middleman. They watched the American appetite for speed, and they saw a flaw in the market. The bikers were producing a product that was weak, toxic, and inconsistent. The supply was bottlenecked by the difficulty of obtaining chemicals. The cartels realized something profound. Methamphetamine is the ultimate capitalist drug. Unlike cocaine, which requires the specific climate of the Andes to grow coca leaves, or heroin, which needs the poppy fields of Afghanistan or the Golden Triangle, methamphetamine has no agricultural soul. It is weatherproof. It is season-proof. It is born entirely of man-made chemicals. If you have the precursors, you can make it anywhere, at any time, in infinite quantities. And the cartels had the precursors. While the US government was cracking down on local pharmacies to stop bikers from buying a few boxes of cold medicine, the Mexican organizations were bypassing the drugstore entirely. They went straight to the source. They used their immense wealth to forge connections with massive chemical manufacturers in China and India. They didn't buy boxes, they bought shipping containers. Tons of ephedrine and pseudoephedrine began to flow across the Pacific, docking in ports like Lázaro Cárdenas, hidden under false manifests or protected by bribes that exceeded the annual budget of a small city. With the supply chain secured, the production method evolved. They adopted the ephedrine reduction method, often called the Nazi method, because it harkened back to the original German synthesis of the 1930s. It was cleaner, faster, and far more potent than the bikers' P2P sludge. This shift gave birth to the super lab. Forget the image of the dirty trailer park or the exploding motel room. To understand the modern meth trade, you must visualize an industrial facility hidden deep in the rugged terrain of the Sierra Madre or the deserts of Sinaloa. Picture a warehouse, camouflaged from the air by tarps and vegetation. Inside, the environment is sterile, lit by humming fluorescent banks. The floor is concrete, scrubbed clean. The equipment is not scavenged. It is industrial grade. Giant stainless steel reactors, capable of holding hundreds of gallons of volatile solution, stand in rows like silent sentinels. Ventilation systems, worth thousands of dollars, scrub the air of toxic fumes to protect the investment, the product, and the workers. The men working here are not addicts, picking at their skin. They are professionals. Some are university-trained chemists, recruited from legitimate industries or poached from universities with offers of salaries they could never earn legally. They wear hazmat suits, respirators, and heavy rubber gloves. They follow strict protocols. They measure temperature and pressure with digital precision. They are not cooking a batch for the weekend. They are manufacturing a commodity for a continent. A single super lab can produce hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine in a single cycle. When the crystallization process is complete, the result is breathtakingly terrifying. It is no longer the yellow, oily powder of the biker era. It is clear. It is jagged. It looks like crushed glass or diamonds. It is 95% pure. This is ice. This is crystal. It is the pharmaceutical perfection of Pervitin, resurrected and amplified to a level of potency that the human brain was never designed to handle. Two organizations rose to dominate this new industrial landscape: the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. The Sinaloa Cartel, led for years by the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, operated like a legacy Fortune 500 company. They built their empire on stability, vast distribution networks, and deep political corruption. They were the old guard, the architects of the tunnel strategy. Realizing that driving trucks through checkpoints was risky, they went under them. Engineering teams, equipped with advanced mining technology, dug tunnels stretching nearly a mile from Mexico into unsuspecting warehouses in California or Arizona. These weren't dirt holes. They were reinforced passages with lighting, ventilation, and rail systems. A single tunnel could move tons of product in a night, undetected by satellites or border dogs. Then there is the CJNG, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. If Sinaloa was the established corporation, CJNG was the aggressive, hostile takeover. Known for extreme, theatrical violence and military-grade weaponry, they expanded rapidly. They treated methamphetamine not just as a product, but as a weapon of expansion. They lowered the price. They flooded the market. They forced the competition out with bullets and high-purity product. The scale of this operation created a global logistics network that rivals Amazon or FedEx. The precursors arrive from Asia. The cooking happens in the industrial fortresses of Mexico. The finished product is packaged in creative, almost artistic ways to cross the border. Liquid meth is dissolved and hidden in windshield washer, fluid bottles, gas tanks, or even bottles labeled as mezcal or beer. It is smuggled in tires, in hollowed-out religious statues, in pallets of avocados. Once it crosses the border into the United States, it is taken to conversion labs, often ordinary suburban houses, where the liquid is dried back into crystal shards. From there, it flows into the veins of America. It travels up the I-5 corridor to the Pacific Northwest. It flows east to the Rust Belt. It floods the rural towns of the Midwest. But this industrial efficiency comes with a staggering human cost, a cruelty that is baked into the economics of the shadow market. The cartels are not just drug traffickers, they are paramilitary states. In regions where the superlabs operate, the cartel is the law. They pave the roads, they fund the churches, and they kill without hesitation. The plata o plomo, silver or lead philosophy, ensures that police chiefs, judges, and politicians look the other way. The violence required to maintain this monopoly is medieval in its brutality. To protect the superlabs and the smuggling routes, Rivals are not just killed, they are made examples of. Bodies are hung from bridges. Mass graves are filled with those who refused to pay the piso tax, or those who simply saw too much. The chemists themselves live in a gilded cage. They are paid fortunes, but they can never resign. Their knowledge makes them valuable assets, but also liabilities. Many are kept in isolation, working under the watchful eyes of heavily armed enforcers, knowing that a bad batch or a loose tongue means death. And then there is the economic devastation of the product itself. By industrializing production, the cartels achieved something the bikers never could. They made meth cheaper than alcohol. In the 1990s and 2000s, as the purity skyrocketed to 95%, the price plummeted. This inverted the normal laws of economics. Usually, a higher quality product costs more. But the super labs were so efficient, the volume so massive, that they could afford to sell premium ice for rock bottom prices. This economic weapon was aimed squarely at the most vulnerable populations. In the United States, it targeted the rural poor, the unemployed industrial workers, the people left behind by the modern economy. For $20, a person could buy a high that lasted for 12 hours. It was a vacation from misery that fit in a pocket, but the 95% purity was a double-edged sword. The ice produced by the cartels was so potent that it rewired the brain faster than the old biker crank ever could. The transition from recreational user to full-blown psychotic addict, the tweaker, happened in months, not years. The neurotoxicity was amplified. The psychosis was more severe. The cartels had essentially created a consumer base of slaves. By the time the authorities realized what was happening, the river of meth had become a flood. The U.S. government tried to tighten regulations on pseudoephedrine again, moving it behind the pharmacy counter with the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005. It worked, briefly, to stop the small domestic labs. The shake and bake cooks in their trailers could no longer get their pills. But the cartels just laughed. They didn't need American pharmacies. They had the Pacific Ocean. They shifted tactics again. When ephedrine became harder to source globally due to international pressure, their chemists simply invented new ways to make it, using different chemicals like phenylacetic acid or reverting to a hyper-advanced version of the old P2P method that removed the impurities to create a product that was indistinguishable from the plant-based version. The superlabs never stopped humming. The fluorescent lights never turned off. As we stand in the present day, looking back at this industrial revolution of vice, the scale is almost impossible to comprehend. We are no longer talking about a drug problem. We are talking about a geopolitical force. The revenue of the Mexican cartels rivals the GDP of small nations. Their reach extends into Europe, into Australia, into Asia. The molecule that Nagai synthesized in a quiet Berlin lab, the molecule that Hitler used to try and conquer Europe, has finally found its perfect masters. It has been stripped of its medical pretense. It has been stripped of its biker rebellion. It has become a pure, crystalline product of global capitalism, manufactured with cold precision, packaged with ruthless efficiency, and delivered to a world that is desperate to feel something, anything, other than pain. The industrial age of methamphetamine has not just changed the drug, it has changed the world. And deep inside the brain of the user, the arrival of this 95% pure crystal was about to trigger a neurological event so catastrophic that it would redefine the very nature of addiction. The Supper Labs had built the bomb. Now, it was time to see what happened when it detonated inside the human skull. The Super Labs had built the bomb. Now, it was time to see what happened when it detonated inside the human skull. Because while the logistics of the cartels are impressive, they are nothing compared to the devastating efficiency of the biological machinery they are exploiting. To understand the true horror of methamphetamine, we must shrink down. We must leave the vast deserts of Mexico and the cluttered living rooms of the attics and travel inward, past the skin, through the blood-brain barrier, and into the microscopic universe of the neuron. This is where the real war is fought. This is where the human soul is effectively held for ransom by a chemical key. The human brain is an ecosystem of delicate balance, a biological computer that runs on a complex currency of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. The most famous and the most critical for our survival is dopamine. Pop culture often mislabels dopamine as the pleasure chemical, but that is an oversimplification. Dopamine is the chemical of motivation. It is the biological marker that tells the brain, this is good, this is important for survival. Do it again. When you eat a delicious meal, your brain releases dopamine. When you have sex, it releases dopamine. When you accomplish a difficult task, it releases dopamine. It is the reward system that has kept our species alive for hundreds of thousands of years, guiding us toward food, reproduction, and success. Imagine this system as a gentle river flowing through a valley. In a normal state, the river flows steadily. When something good happens, say you eat a steak when you're hungry, the river rises slightly. The water level goes up. The valley is irrigated, and you feel satisfied. In scientific terms, a natural reward, like food or sex, might increase dopamine levels in the brain by 50% to 100% above the baseline. It is a controlled rise, a pleasant surge that eventually recedes, returning the river to its banks. Even other drugs, like cocaine, are like a flash flood. They might spike the levels significantly, but the waters recede relatively quickly. Methamphetamine is not a river. It is a tsunami. When high-purity methamphetamine enters the bloodstream and hits the brain, it doesn't just stimulate the release of dopamine. It forces the floodgates open and then welds them shut. The molecule operates with a terrifying, two-pronged mechanism. First, it mimics dopamine, tricking the neurons into pumping their entire supply of the chemical out into the synapse, the gap between neurons. But then, it does something more insidious. It blocks the reuptake pumps. Normally, after a dopamine release, the brain recycles the chemical. Little pumps vacuum it back up to be used later, preventing overstimulation. Methamphetamine jams these pumps. It also inhibits the enzymes that are supposed to break the dopamine down. The result is a catastrophic accumulation. The dopamine has nowhere to go. It piles up in the synapse, screaming at the receptors over and over and over again. If a good meal raises dopamine by 100%, methamphetamine raises it by 1,200% or more. Visualizing this number is difficult, so let's go back to the river. If normal life is a gentle stream and cocaine is a heavy storm, methamphetamine is a dam breaking. A wall of water a mile high crashes down into the valley. It destroys everything in its path. It drowns the trees, the houses, the landscape. For the user, this feels like godhood. The rush is immediate and overwhelming. It is a feeling of limitless power, of absolute clarity, of euphoria so intense it makes an orgasm feel like a mild sneeze. The user feels invincible. Fatigue vanishes. Hunger vanishes. The brain is flooded with so much survival importance, signal that the drug effectively becomes more important than food, more important than sleep, more important than love, more important than life itself. The brain, in its primitive logic, looks at this 1-200% spike and says, "This is the most valuable thing we have ever encountered. We must pursue this at all costs." This is how addiction is encoded instantly. It is not a lack of willpower. It is a biological reprogramming. The hierarchy of needs is rewritten, with the crystal sitting at the very top, and everything else, children, job, dignity, buried in the mud below. But the human brain is not designed to handle a tsunami. It is designed for homeostasis, balance. When it is assaulted by this chemical violence, it tries to protect itself. This is where the tragedy of the hijacked brain truly begins. Faced with this deafening noise of dopamine, the brain initiates a process called downregulation. The neurons, screaming in agony from the overstimulation, begin to prune away their dopamine receptors. Think of these receptors as tiny ears listening for the chemical message. To stop the deafening noise, the brain effectively cuts off its own ears. Simultaneously, the brain reduces its own natural production of dopamine. It thinks, well, there is so much of this chemical flooding around, I don't need to make any more. This adaptation happens quickly, especially with the 95% pure ice from the super labs. And then the drug wears off. The tsunami recedes. The water drains away. But the valley is not the same. It is scorched earth. The user wakes up in a brain that has been stripped. The natural dopamine levels have crashed to below baseline, and the receptors, the ears, are gone. This state is called anhedonia. It is a Greek word that means without pleasure. But the definition doesn't capture the horror of the lived experience. Anhedonia is not sadness. It is not the blues. It is a profound, echoing emptiness. Imagine a world where color doesn't exist. You look at a sunset, and you know intellectually it should be beautiful, but you feel nothing. You eat your favorite meal, and it tastes like cardboard. You listen to music, and it's just irritating noise. You hug your child, and you feel as much emotional connection as you would hugging a mannequin. The machinery of joy has been broken. In this state, life is not just difficult, it is unbearable. The user is trapped in a gray, flat landscape where nothing matters. They are lethargic, depressed, and hollow. And here lies the diabolical trap of methamphetamine addiction. The user doesn't necessarily relapse because they want to get high again. They relapse because they just want to feel normal. They want to feel something. They know that there is a chemical key in their pocket that can turn the lights back on, even if just for a few hours. The brain, remembering the 1-200% spike, screams for the drug. It views the drug as the only way to survive the drought. This is why methamphetamine has one of the highest relapse rates of any substance. It's not just chasing a party, it's fleeing a funeral, the funeral of one's own emotions. And the damage is not just chemical, it is structural. Methamphetamine is neurotoxic. It physically damages the axon terminals of the neurons. Long-term use can lead to cognitive deficits that look like Alzheimer's disease or traumatic brain injury. The paranoia and psychosis we see, the shadow people, the bugs under the skin, are the result of a brain that is misfiring, hallucinating patterns in the noise because its processing centers are eroding. But perhaps the most painful aspect of this neuroscience is the timeline of recovery. If you break a leg, it heals in 6 weeks. If you break your dopamine system with methamphetamine, it takes years. Scientific studies show that even after a user stops taking the drug, the brain remains in a dopamine deficit state for a long time. The receptors grow back, but they grow back with agonizing slowness. It can take 6 months, 12 months, sometimes 18 months for the brain to return to a baseline where a smile feels real again. Imagine telling someone who is in profound pain that they have to wait 2 years to feel better. That is the mountain the recovering addict must climb. They have to wake up every morning in the gray world, fight the screaming cravings of their hijacked survival instincts, and choose not to use, with no immediate reward. They have to have faith that the color will come back, even when their own biology is telling them it won't. This is the invisible pain of the epidemic. We see the mugshots, the sores, the teeth. We don't see the silence inside the head. We don't see the neurological prison that the super labs have manufactured. The cartels ship the product in trucks and tunnels, but the real destination was never a city or a street corner. The destination was the synapse. And once they conquered that, they didn't just take the user's money, they took their humanity. But the brain is plastic. It can heal. The river can flow again, eventually. But for now, millions of people are stranded in the drought, waiting for the rain that only time, and not a pill, can bring. But we cannot view this epidemic solely through the lens of receptors and synapses. We must view it through the eyes of the people who woke up one day to find that the drought had consumed their entire lives. Because while the chemistry is universal, the suffering is always personal. When we think of a methamphetamine addict, society has conditioned us to see a caricature, a zombie with rotting teeth, picking at their skin in a dark alley or a trailer park. We use labels like junkie or tweaker to distance ourselves, to build a psychological wall that says, that is them, that is not us. But the terrifying truth of this drug is that it does not discriminate. It does not check your bank account, your zip code, or your college degree before it rewires your survival instincts. It is a predator that often starts its feast in the most respectable of places. Consider the story of Sarah. If you met Sarah in 1998, you would have seen the very definition of a pillar of the community. She was a high school English teacher in a quiet, rural town in Oregon. She was the woman who stayed late to help students with their college essays, the mother who never missed a soccer game, the neighbor who baked casseroles for church potlucks. But Sarah had a secret, one that began not with a dealer, but with a doctor, struggling with post-pregnancy weight that she couldn't seem to shed. She went to her physician. He prescribed her Desoxyn. It was FDA approved. It was legal. It was, in her eyes, medicine. And for the first year, it was a miracle. The weight melted off. Her classroom energy was infectious. She could grade papers until 2 a.m. and wake up fresh at 6 a.m. to make breakfast. She felt like Superwoman. She didn't know she was flooding her brain with the same chemical that fueled the blitzkrieg. But then the prescription ran out. The doctor, perhaps noticing her elevated heart rate or her jittery demeanor cut her off. But her brain, now deep in the throes of that invisible drought, demanded the water. Sarah didn't want to get high. She just wanted to function. She needed to grade those papers. She needed to be the perfect mother. So she made a choice that would have been unthinkable a year prior. She asked a friend. She found a connection. She bought methamphetamine on the street. The descent was not a free fall. It was a slow, agonizing slide. First, it was just on weekends. Then, it was every morning. Then, the slide accelerated. Within a year of her first street purchase, the woman who had taught Shakespeare was living in her car. She lost her job, she lost her home, and then, the ultimate tragedy, she lost custody of her 2 children. Imagine the shame of that moment, sitting in a homeless encampment, surrounded by the filth of addiction, clutching a picture of the children you love more than life itself, but being chemically unable to stop doing the one thing that keeps you from them. Sarah spent 15 years in that hell. She cycled through prisons, endured overdoses that nearly stopped her heart, and survived the brutal violence of the street. Today, Sarah is in recovery. She works at a treatment center, helping others find their way back. But she lost a decade and a half of her life. She missed her children's childhoods. She is a survivor, yes, but she carries the scars of a war she never meant to fight. Then there is the story of Mark. Mark represents a different kind of tragedy, one that is perhaps even more hidden. Mark was a dentist, a successful professional with a thriving practice in the suburbs. He was the man who fixed smiles. He was the golden boy. His addiction didn't start with vanity. It started with ambition, the pressure of running a business, the student loans, the mortgage, the demand to see more patients in a day than was humanly possible. It all piled up. He felt he was drowning in obligations. A friend at a party offered him a little boost, just a line of crystal to help him get through a weekend of paperwork. Mark found that the drug made him feel laser-focused. He could perform intricate root canals with a steady hand and a boundless enthusiasm. He could work 12-hour days and still have energy for the country club. He thought he had found the secret to success. He thought he was smarter than the drug. But methamphetamine is a cruel ironist. The drug that Mark took to build his empire eventually began to dismantle it piece by piece. The first sign was the isolation. Mark stopped going to the country club. He stopped having dinner with his wife. He would stay in his office late into the night, working, which eventually turned into taking apart his dental equipment, convinced there were surveillance bugs hidden in the X-ray machines. Then came the physical toll. The man who had dedicated his life to oral hygiene began to grind his teeth. The bruxism, the uncontrollable clenching of the jaw common in meth users, wore his own enamel down to dust. He developed the very meth mouth he had spent his career treating in others. The golden boy began to rot from the inside out. His hands, once steady enough to perform surgery, began to tremor. He became paranoid, snapping at patients, accusing his hygienists of stealing from him. The end came when he was found passed out in his own exam chair, a syringe on the tray next to the sterilized instruments. He lost his license. He lost his practice. He lost his reputation. Mark's story reminds us that intelligence is not an inoculation against addiction. You can have a doctorate, you can have a high IQ, and your dopamine receptors will still break just like anyone else's. The drug doesn't care if you wear a hoodie or a white coat. These stories, the teacher and the dentist, are not anomalies. They are the human face of the statistics we hear on the news. Behind every number, the 2.5 million Americans using meth, the 32,000 deaths, there is a Sarah, there is a Mark, there is a construction worker who took it to work a double shift and never came home. There is a student who took it to study for finals and ended up in a psych ward. There is a mother who took it to clean the house and ended up losing her family. These people were not looking for oblivion. They were looking for a way to cope with the demands of life. They were looking for energy, for focus, for relief. They fell into a trap that was set by biology and baited by circumstance. And once they were in the trap, the judgment of society kept them there. We look at them with disgust instead of compassion. We see their fall as a moral failing rather than a medical emergency. We forget that before the mugshot, there was a graduation photo. Before the addiction, there was a dream. The tragedy of the forgotten stories is not just that they fell, but that we, as a society, often choose to leave them there. We write them off as collateral damage in a war on drugs that has long since lost its way. But if we look closely at Sarah or Mark or any of the millions of others, we see a terrifying reflection. We see our own desire to be better, to work harder, to be perfect. We see how fragile the line really is between a cup of coffee and a pill, between getting by and losing everything. They are not them. They are us, just one chemical mistake away from the abyss. And until we understand that, until we can look at an addict and see the human being hidden beneath the scars, the epidemic will continue to claim the best and the brightest among us. The shadow of the molecule is long, and it covers us all. The shadow of the molecule is long, and it covers us all. But if we have learned anything from this 100-year journey, it is that we cannot dispel that shadow simply by fighting in the dark. We have traveled a vast distance together. We started on a windswept plateau in Mongolia with a humble shrub clinging to the earth. We watched a Japanese chemist in a coal-stained Berlin laboratory isolate a soul from that plant, searching for a medicine and finding a monster. We watched that monster put on a gray uniform and march across Europe, turning young boys into sleepless machines of war. We saw it hide in the aprons of American mothers striving for an impossible perfection. And we saw it ride on the backs of motorcycles into the heart of the counterculture. And finally, we saw it stripped of all its disguises, mass-produced in the cold steel reactors of the cartels and injected into the veins of the forgotten. The history of methamphetamine is not a straight line. It is a tragic loop. It is a story of human hubris. We thought we could improve upon nature. We thought we could synthesize energy, bottle confidence, and manufacture happiness. We underestimated the biological cost. We failed to see that a chemical that borrows energy from the future eventually demands to be paid back with interest, and the currency of that repayment is our sanity, our health, and our humanity. But the story does not have to end in the dark. For decades, our response to this crisis has been one of punishment. We declared a war on drugs, treating the addict as an enemy combatant. We arrested the soldier in the trench, the housewife in the kitchen, and the teenager in the street. We filled our prisons thinking we could incarcerate the problem away. It didn't work. The molecule is just a powder. It has no morality. It cannot be arrested. It flows like water to wherever there is pain Wherever there's a void that needs filling, the true lesson of this history is that methamphetamine is not the cause of our brokenness. It is a symptom of it. People do not destroy their lives with crystal meth because they want to be criminals. They do it because they are in pain. They do it to cope with trauma, with poverty, with loneliness, or with the crushing pressure to be more than they are. Therefore, the antidote to the epidemic is not just law enforcement, it is connection. Recovery is possible. The brain, battered by the dopamine tsunami, can heal. The receptors can grow back. The gray world can find its color again. But this healing cannot happen in isolation. It happens in community. It happens when we replace judgment with compassion. It happens when we look at the tweaker on the street and see not a monster, but a person like Sarah or Mark, a person who is drowning and needs a hand, not a handcuff. The molecule that Nagai Nagayoshi synthesized in 1893 cannot be uncreated. It is here. It will always be here, lurking in the chemistry set of the universe. The question is not how we destroy it, but how we live with it. We live with it by building a society where people don't feel the desperate need to escape their own reality. We live with it by acknowledging that we are fragile, biological creatures, not machines designed for endless productivity. We live with it by turning on the light. Thank you for taking this journey into the deep history of methamphetamine. This was a heavy story, one that required us to look into the abyss of human nature. If you found value in this investigation, if it gave you a new perspective on the history of the 20th century or the nature of addiction, I ask you to do one thing: share it. Share it not for the algorithm, but to break the stigma. Share it so that we can stop looking at addiction as a moral failing and start understanding it as a human tragedy that requires a human solution. Let me know in the comments below. Did this history change how you view the war on drugs? Do you have a story from your own community that needs to be heard? Let's keep the conversation going with respect and with empathy. I'm the Nightfall Chronicles. Until next time, stay curious and take care of each other.